And welcome everybody to our session. Um, it's the next instalment in our series of tree talks, all about growing trees. This one's called Happy Healthy Trees. So my name is Will, and I'm from the Tree Council. But first, a little bit of housekeeping. So this session's about an hour and a half long, and we'll include about an hour of talks and videos. And following that, we'll do about half an hour of questions and answers. So you'll notice that in the bar at the bottom of your screen, there are two boxes that you can write in. We've got a question and answer box and a chat box. Please put your questions in the Q&A box and keep the chat box open to comments and suggestions. And that will help us sort questions later on when we go into the question and answer section. So what we'll do is that we'll do the talks and the videos, and then we'll move on and we'll do the questions and answers way. We'll read out the questions that you've popped in the question and answer box, and then we'll answer those. So all our sessions are recorded and available on YouTube afterwards, after you finish. So if you miss anything or you want to go back over anything, you can catch up and watch it at any time. So yeah, if you go to the Tree Council's YouTube channel, they're all on there, and a link should be dropping into the chat now. As we go through, we will be putting links into the chat for you to follow, but don't worry about if you lose track of them, because in the email that we'll send following this, which will have a link to the recording, we'll also put all the links of things that we've talked about today. So if you're new to the Tree Council, we are a national charity and we bring everybody together for the love of trees. Now, we fund, plant and care for trees and hedgerows with our tree wardens and communities all across the country, and we do that through our community grant schemes. And a really big hello and thank you to any tree wardens out there in the audience today. We have a schools programme, so we aim to inspire the next generation of environmentalists through our national schools programme. And if we've got any young tree champions out there today or teachers, hello and welcome, and thank you so much for everything that you do. We use practical science and research, and we aim to influence national policy and support best practice for trees and hedgerows and the environment. And all together, we work with amazing partner organisations to harness the power of partnership and try and create a healthy tree-filled future. Our session today is part of our Life on the Hedge project, which is all about raising awareness of how amazing our hedgerows are and all they do for us. It's our aim to create more and better connected hedgerows all across the country and promote best practice and better hedgerow management all across the country as well. So to do this, we're funded by the Trees Call to Action Fund, which is a national fund which is developed by DEFRA and the Forestry Commission, and it's delivered to us through the National Lottery Heritage Fund. So thank you to all our funders. But today, we're going to be focusing on a few key areas. We're going to think about what we might need from a space to grow trees, and let's talk a little bit about kit. We're going to introduce the idea of biosecurity. We're going to think about why biosecurity might be important and some of the things that you can do to try and be more biosecure. We're going to go to a fantastic example of someone making a real difference in their local area. We're going to go to Janet in Shropshire. And then my colleague Phil is going to outline some of the things that you can do this weekend in the nursery, in the tree nursery near you. But let's catch up on where we're up to with our calendar of helpful online talks. And these talks are designed to help you on your tree growing journey. So the aim is that by the end of the series, you'll have a kind of calendar of sessions that you'll be able to rewatch, and together they'll give you the basics to help you go out and get growing your own trees, and maybe even set the seed to set up new community tree nurseries in your local areas. So the next talk that we have is on the 25th of June. That's called Growing Up. And that's where we're going to talk about that tricky period in a young tree's life, which is summer. It's time of sun and low rainfall sometimes. So it's really tricky time. So we'll explore what you might need to think about to ensure that your trees are growing well throughout that period, how you do it. And again, we'll send the link around for this recording, and also links to the next talk in the follow-up emails. And keep your eye out on our social media channels for more details of exactly when all these talks are going to be and who's going to be on them and things. So as outlined in our last webinar, which was a bit of a summary, these sessions are supported by two really fantastic online resources. We've got the Tree Grows Guide and the Young Trees Grows Guide. And these offer tree growing guidance at different levels of where you're up to on your tree growing journey. So the Young Tree Grows Guide is a great introduction to growing trees from seed, and it's a really good starting point for laying out the basics in a really easy to understand way. And the Tree Grows Guide is of slightly more detailed and can really help you set up a fully fledged community tree nursery. Now, both of them can help you with every step from collecting seed all the way through to knowing which tools you might need, all the way through to planting your trees out when they're ready to go. So please check them out for more information on top of everything that we cover today. And there'll be links dropping into the chat for those now. And of course, all tree growers in this country can get involved with the Community Tree Nursery Collaborative. So the Community Tree Nursery Collaborative, or CTNC, was set up in 2021, and it's facilitated by the charity the Fellowship of the Trees. It's a peer-to-peer learning network to enable community tree nurseries to share knowledge and resources and kind of build a community of tree growers all across the UK. They're also funded to run free webinars on all aspects of setting up and running community tree nurseries, and they also run open space Zoom sessions, so you can bring questions that you might have and share knowledge on topics you need support with. And they're led by a core of really experienced community tree nurseries. You can register to be part of the collaborative and receive email updates through their website, or you can join the Facebook members group to get support from the community tree nursery community. They have absolutely loads of really, really fantastic online videos on their YouTube channel, so please do go and watch these as they contain loads of useful tips about all the different aspects of growing trees. So there should be links to their website, Facebook page, that YouTube channel, and an Eventbrite link, which will link you through to their upcoming events now in the chat. But we'll kick off with having a think about what we might need to set up an area that's fit for growing trees. So last time we looked at what a community tree nursery is, and what we learned is that there's no real one size fits all when it comes to what your community tree nursery should look like, and it ranges from it could range from an individual, could be one person in the back garden, all the way up to a full-on social enterprise working a bit more like a commercial tree nursery, growing thousands and thousands of trees. So there's a real variability in scale. But across all community tree nurseries, there's a few simple constraints, constants which remain, which we'll talk about over the next few slides. But we'll remind ourselves of nature's cycle first, and this will give the activities and therefore what we need from our tree growing space. So remember, we went through this in more detail in the last session, so please do catch up on that on the recording. And we also linked in how each of our sessions will fit into this nature's cycle. So watch our last webinar, Getting Sowing, to catch up on that. So we have a mature tree, which is fantastic, and it will produce flowers in spring, which then get pollinated and become seeds in summer and autumn, which we then collect either from the tree or when they fall onto the floor. We then stratify our seed over the winter to kickstart them into germinating in the spring before they start germinating, and we pot them up and plant them out, and we look after them until they're big enough so we can dig them up and plant them in their final home, where they grow up to become mature trees, and the whole cycle gets reset and goes round and round. So our tree nursery sites, unless you're very lucky to have an absolutely loads and loads and loads of land where you are collecting all your seeds and planting all those trees, it's unlikely that you house all these activities, but rather you'll focus on these key stages of the growing cycle, ranging from processing seed through to when we're up to a point where our trees are ready to be lifted and then planted out. And it's best not to complicate things. So to take it to absolute basics, what do trees need to grow? Well, they just need a few simple things, really, theoretically. wherever we're looking to grow trees, we need to make sure they have access to light, to water, to nutrients, and to air in order for them to be able to photosynthesize and grow. And we need to have space for them to grow as well. Obviously, we probably don't need to worry too much about availability for air, but for light, nutrients, and water and space, these are all things that we can manage. So we might have a limited amount of light we have available, but if we're in a bit of a shady spot, but generally a nice sheltered sunny spot is good because there'll be year-round sun, which we can then manage if it gets too much with things like shade netting. I say sheltered because windy sites can be a bit difficult to grow in. If you just think about where you'd prefer to grow, kind of blasted on the edge of a cliff somewhere or sheltered down somewhere out of the wind. If you only got a shady spot to grow your trees, that's still fine. It might just take a little bit longer for your trees to grow. Or you might want to focus on some of the more shade tolerant species, which might grow a bit better in your conditions. But, a windowsill greenhouse or polytunnel where we can get slightly elevated temperatures and things can help trees grow a little bit more quickly. So if you've got a very shady spot, then having one of these areas could help you counteract some of the growth reductions that you see due to light availability. Water is, of course, super important, and making sure that we have some on hand for those summer months is really important, although it's important not to overwater young trees, as this can stimulate shallow rooting and can also kill off roots if they are kept too wet through waterlogged soil. So on-site, collecting your own rainwater is a bit of a gold standard. It's absolutely amazing if you can do it, but it's not always enough. And there are loads of ways to do this, all the way from a simple water butt connected to guttering from the roof of a shed, to specially created irrigation ponds if you're kind of growing thousands of trees, and big commercial tree nurseries and plant nurseries quite often have their own big irrigation ponds which they use to draw water from. But if collecting rainwater is an issue for you, you haven't got a space for a water butt or something, access to a water supply through a tap will be needed. So trees get their nutrients from what they grow in. So although trees are specialized to grow in very kind of specific growing conditions, it would take a lot of time to kind of create soil conditions perfect for every single species to grow. So generally a happy medium is what we try and go for. And that happy medium is ground that is nutrient rich, which generally means there's a lot of organic matter in it, and well draining. And how you do this will depend on your growing method. So you could create your own compost from scratch, or you could buy some in. If doing this on a small scale in containers, you might need to bring some in. Or if you're going down the bare root road, which we'll talk about in a bit, digging in some compost into even some quite poor soils and adding some grit to help improve drainage can provide a better medium for your trees to grow in. So yeah, if you're making your own compost, you'll want to think about where you might want to have your compost heap. We'll talk a little bit more about this in a few slides time. But what do we need? So there are many tasks that can be a bit fiddly, such as processing seeds for stratification and sowing germinating seeds into root trainers or pots, which we'll cover a bit later on. So having a workspace at a comfortable height to do these activities can really help. And if you're doing this by yourself, this could just be a potting table in your shed, or it could even just be your kitchen table or your kitchen side. It doesn't. If you're doing this as a group, such as a school, or setting up your own community tree nursery, you might need to have a bit more space. So having somewhere you can do this together, such as in a covered polytunnel or a greenhouse like this one here, with a table can really help. Plus, this then doubles up as a shelter for you in bad weather, extending the amount of time that you can do your activities and can give your young trees a head start. But this is really nice to have. And even if you just have a balcony or a backyard and use pots, going al fresco completely is fine as well. And Phil later on is going to talk to us a little bit more about the benefits of polytunnels. So in the Tree Growers Guide, which I mentioned before, in section 3, we have a kit list of all the tools that you might need for the different activities you'll need to carry out. So please do have a look at this to know what bits of kit you might need for each of the activities. And obviously somewhere to be able to store all your equipment is important. But again, this can be completely down to kind of the scale that you're growing at. And it can be what you have available, ranging from a cupboard in your house to a shelf in your shed to a standalone tool store, or even a shipping container if you're doing this on a big scale. And tool stores, especially if they're secure, can be a really great place not just to prevent tools going missing, but can also keep out unwanted pests such as mice and things. So you can store seeds in there to stratify over the winter. So having a secure tool store can be really useful. And of course, we need people to do these tasks. So it could just be you by yourself, or if we're trying to grow loads of trees, or growing trees for education or your local community, finding helping hands can make light work. So this could be through your local schools, or it could be through your local tree warden network. It could be through local conservation volunteers, neighbours, people at the allotment site, anything really. So we have an amazing tree warden network all across the UK. And there should be a link dropping into the chat now to our tree warden networks if you want to check if there is one in your local area to get involved in tree activities. It's worth checking out. So in our tree growing space, we'll need somewhere to process seeds ready for stratification. Remember from last time, this stratification process is just a fancy term we use for the cold period over winter that our seeds need in this country to trigger germination in spring. Won't go much into much detail here because this was kind of covered in our seed gathering masterclass, which you can watch on our YouTube channel. But a place where you can work at a table or work surface is needed here because it can be a bit fiddly. Yeah, jobs like extracting seeds from fruit, removing husks, mixing them with stratification medium, that kind of thing. And then you'll need somewhere where you can stratify your seeds over winter, and this completely depends on the on how many trees you're looking to grow. So I'm growing a small amount of trees, and my stratifying seeds have been in old takeaway boxes here with lids, with the lids kind of perforated with holes in the top and bottom, in the kind of small plastic greenhouse I've got outside, ranging all the way up to larger scale. This is a community tree nursery down in Devon who are using old bathtubs on a really big scale to stratify their seeds. And you'll notice that they're all covered with this fine mesh to keep out things like squirrels, mice, rats. So depending on the size for this, yeah, it can range loads. But you'll need somewhere comfortable to work and somewhere to store seeds over the winter. We'll talk about specifics of seed sowing later with Phil, but for the basics of what space you might need, it's nothing too complicated. It's quite similar to previous slides. So it can be a fiddly job, and generally we sow into either root trainers, seed trays, pots, or seed beds. And if sowing into root trainers or pots, being able to do so at a work surface can really help. Many tree nurseries build little raised platforms for their root trainers, pots and portable seed beds, and this makes them easier to weed, and it can also raise them up and protect them from pests. And then you can wrap them with this shade netting, which can kind of doubles up from protecting trees from sun scorch in the summer, and can also keep out some pests as well. And alternatively, germinating seeds can be planted straight into the ground or into raised beds. So when our germinating seeds, we're planting them out, we want to make sure that they're getting enough water, nutrients, light, and air. So our spacing is important. The amount of space available for your tree planting ambitions is kind of dependent on the number of trees you wanted to grow, and also how you intend to grow them. So generally, we either plant our trees into containers or into the ground. We'll be having a session on how to move trees and plant them in autumn and winter, and which will cover all this in much more detail. But and also look at the rationales for choosing the different techniques. But root trainers, which you can see on the left and middle here, are designed to house trees ready until they're ready to be planted out. And it could be great for trees that don't like disturbance, things that have kind of a strong taproot, things like oak and birch. They all have strong tap roots. They don't like being moved too much. So if you put them in root trainers, you don't have to kind of rip them up when you lift them, and it can help them transplant a bit better. They're quite space efficient as well, so you can get about 80 cells per square meter, and they create cell-grown trees. And they'd be a great option if you have limited space, or even if you were just having a go somewhere where you haven't got any ground available, somewhere like even on a balcony or in a backyard. Other types of container include, normal pots like you can see in a garden centre, or ones that you can create, things like the bottom of half a milk carton, those kind of things. And they can be really space efficient as well. But what we want to watch out for in those is making sure that the roots don't get what we call root bound, which is where they go round and round the container, because this can be bad for the tree in the long run. And if this is happening, it's time to find a bigger container and move them on. So on the right, you can see some fancy black pots. Now, these are great products. They're called air pots, and they've got lots of holes in them, but they still hold the soil in, but allow access to the air on the outside. So roots don't like air; they want to be underground. And in these pots, when the root comes out to the side, rather than going round and round, it feels the air on the outside and it kills the tip of the root off, and it stimulates lots and lots of other roots to go, creating a really nice, dense, fibrous root network, which is what we want from our young trees. So it prevents this root girdling that we talked about. And yeah, you can get pots in loads of different sizes, all the way from really quite small, all the way up to ones that might take about 1 meter square in themselves. So depending on how big the tree that you want to be giving out at the end of the end of when you're planting it, it depends on how much room it's going to take up. So you might get up to about 100 small containers in a square meter, or just one very large pot. Another benefit of containers is that although they can be a bit of a pain to move, you can move them. So whether that's into or out of a very sunny spot in the summer, or to a more sheltered location in the winter where it's a bit more windy, or into a polytunnel for a bit of speedy growth when they're going, they are movable, which can be useful. But the other way of growing trees is planting the seeds straight into the ground, and then or transplanting seedlings straight into the ground. And bare root trees, they're grown in open beds like you can see here. And these can cover quite a large area in big nurseries. And there's a few things to think about. So when it comes to how deep we want the soil, 15 to 30 centimeters of rooting depth generally should be about enough, assuming it's whips that you're looking to grow. And a whip is just a small tree, which kind of grows anywhere from 20 to 1 meter tall, really. And it's worth noting that if you're growing species that send out a strong taproot or fibrous roots, things like an oak, these can be really difficult to lift if they're left for 2 or 3 seasons. So making sure that you keep on top of lifting your trees and planting them out, or replanting them, is really important, because we don't want them to get too established, because that means that when we have to take them out, it's a bit of a shock. So to help roots develop, we want a nice, loose, free-draining, uncompacted soil. It allows for good drainage, it allows for good root penetration, it allows for the roots to be able to breathe. And this can be achieved by cultivating your land, or if you're going for a no-dig method, applying thick layers of mulch can really help soil compaction. It improves the soil properties, and also keeps weeds at bay. But your trees are likely to grow at different rates depending on what species there are and where they are. And depending on your species, some may be ready to lift and plant in their final location, when they're over 20 centimeters tall. And that could be after the first year, and that could be fast-growing species, things like birch or alder. But trees that aren't quite ready this side, aren't quite this size, will need to be lifted and transplanted to grow out another season, or until they're ready. So we have some species that might take 1 year, some species that might take more than 1 year, 2 years. Generally, we leave about between 10 and 60 centimeters between seedling, and this depends on how big the tree is at the time. So this works out between about 103 trees per meter, respectively. So you might need to do a bit of maths to kind of work out how much land or how much growing area you need for how many trees that you want to grow, and at what size you want to grow them to. The small oaks and the common walnut over here, you can see on the left, they're about 20 centimeters tall, and they've got a spacing at the moment of about 20 to 30 centimeters apart. Whereas we've got some slightly larger oaks on the right, which are about 50 centimeters tall, and these are about 40 centimeters apart between them, and then about 50 centimeters apart between the rows. So if trees are getting a bit too big and crowded, then thinning the trees out or respacing them can allow for better rooting space, can give them better access to nutrients, and it can allow airflow between the trees, which is really important to help prevent the spread of pests and diseases as well. So this process can kind of be repeated for any trees that aren't achieving 20 centimeters ready for planting out after the first year, or if you're wanting to grow larger trees. And it depends how much land you've got. So if you just thin your seed beds out and your with your seedlings, then the number of trees that you have growing in your area is going to decrease, but it's the same amount of area. Or if you can respace your trees, which means you can maintain a similar number of trees, but you're going to need a bigger area. And for some trees that take more than 1 year to get ready before they're planted out, maybe they take 2 years. If you want a steady flow of trees each year, then we might need to think about getting a year ahead. So species that need 2 years might need double the space if we want them going out every year, because we'll want to work in a year in advance. And we're going to stagger our trees that we have half 1 year that are 1 year old, which need another year, and the other half is going to be 2 years old, ready to be planted this season. So we have to stagger it a little bit. And before your trees go out into their final growing locations, you'll want to lift them up and bundle them together for ease. This might need to happen a few days before your trees are picked up or go to their planting site. So if you're growing bare root trees, you will want a place to heel in your trees in where they're bundled to keep the roots nice and moist and healthy. And heeling in is just a fancy term that we use for plonking our trees in a trench temporarily, ready to be lifted. And we just want it so they're nice and covered, and the roots are nice and covered, and they're not going to dry out. We'll cover this more in our talk in December, but that's just a bit of an intro to it. And you don't need lots of room for a heeling in bed. Several hundred trees can sometimes be heeled into a few square meters. So an area of kind of deep, uncompacted, loose soil is really best for this, because it's easy to dig trenches and also easy to lift trees. And making sure that our trees are properly labelled and giving individual projects their own trenches can help you to organise lots of trees ready for going out to different projects. I mean, if you're doing this on a more commercial scale, so the next step up from something like a heeling in bed would have a really fancy cold storage unit or a cold shed, which can help lifted trees stay healthy for longer, but at small scale, it's probably not very feasible because they're quite expensive. So for more information about including equipment and tool lists for different activities and more detailed advice, have a look on section 3 of the Tree Growers Guide. It's just there in the bottom left, and then a link to that should be dropping into the chat now. But the Community Tree Nursery Collaborative have also recently put together a great webinar all about how to set up a community tree nursery. So if you want to learn from the experts, please do go and give that a watch, and a link to that will be dropping into the chat now. So we've looked at the kind of things that you might need to think about when laying out your little tree nursery. And now we're going to think about biosecurity, why it's important, and what we can do to help. But before we do that, there should be a poll popping up now. Can anybody tell us, do you know what the term biosecurity means? Is this a new term to you, or do you know what it is? So if you could answer that, that'd be fantastic. So we've got quite a lot of people who have heard the term, we've got a few who don't, and that's absolutely fine. We'll talk about it more in a second. In fact, it's great that there's people here who haven't heard about it, and we can talk about it more in more detail. So many of you have heard of the term biosecurity, and quite a few of you don't as well, so a good split. But quite simply, biosecurity is just measures that we put in place to prevent the introduction and spread of organisms that are harmful to trees. We've all been through a COVID pandemic, so this idea of things that we can do to prevent the spread of a harmful organism is very routine. It's in everyday life. Every day we hear the slogans of catch it, bin it, kill it. We don't visit vulnerable people when we're poorly ourselves. We kind of monitor what looks a little bit dodgy in the fridge, and many of the principles are, they're exactly the same. So trees, like us, are at risk of getting poorly, and this can be from living causes that we call biotic factors, or they can be from non-living factors, such as the growing environment that trees live in. And these we call abiotic factors. These are non-living factors. And the reality is that nearly always infection is a result of a combination of both two abiotic and biotic factors, causing a plant to be a bit unhappy and then becoming open to infection. So biotic factors could be bacteria, a virus, or a fungus, like the ash dieback we've got here on the left, or the oak powdery mildew we've got over here on the right. And like us, these infections can range from being a bit of a nuisance all the way through to something that can be really potentially quite deadly. So ash dieback at the moment, which our ash trees are dealing with, is something that was spread from ash trees that we imported over from Europe to plant here. And it's been quite devastating. It's projected to kill up to nearly 90% of our ash trees. Cost billions of pounds to clear up. So you can see that the impact of managing pests and diseases can be really immense. But it's not just infection that can damage trees. They're very nutritious and tasty, and some animals and common contenders here are things like mice and rabbits and deer, and a lot of the insects as well, things like caterpillars. They'll eat all parts of the tree, from leaves and seeds to bark and wood. And Dutch elm's disease, which in the last 50 years has wiped out many of our elm trees, is a good example of a bit of a combination here. So it's a fungus that kills the elm trees, but it's spread through the elm bark beetle. So there's two things working there together there. We've got the actual thing that does it for the tree, which is the fungus, but then we've got a carrier. And when something acts as a carrier or courier, we call that carrier a vector. So if you hear somebody calling something a vector, it just means it's something that's transporting another pest or disease. And we have so much global trade now that it's easier for pest and disease to spread without certain measures being put in place. So biosecurity is just trying to minimize the chance of organisms killing or stunting our trees to make sure that they're healthy trees to plant, but also to make sure that when we're not further spreading pests and diseases for our trees that we're growing out into nature, if we're planting trees that are already infected. But yeah, trees are like us, and when they're run down, when we're run down, or we aren't eating properly, we aren't getting enough rest, we're stressed, we're more likely to pick up an infection. But when we're happy, healthy, well-fed, well-watered, rested, our immune system kind of does its job, and we tend not to get ill. And it's the same that's true for trees. So if we can provide the conditions for our trees to be happy in the nursery, then they'll be more resilient to pests and diseases. And these abiotic factors can range from drought through to waterlogged soil, to ground frost killing young roots all the way through to wind exposure and things like that. And a nurseryman down in Norfolk, who'd been growing trees for over 50 years, recently said to us that growing trees isn't rocket science, but if you can think like a tree and put yourself in a tree's shoes, then you can better kind of decide or you can better help them live healthily and happily. But there are some simple things that we can do on our little tree nurseries to prevent the spread of pests and diseases. Following some good practice with regard to soil management can be really beneficial. So any organic matter that you add to your soil, making sure it's good quality, is really important. So to reduce the risk of pathogens in compost, we can use a method called hot composting, or if using a more traditional kind of home cold composting method, we need to make sure that it's well composted. So hot composting is just a method for making compost quite quickly at very high temperatures, and cold compost is a more traditional way that takes longer and can take up anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. But if you're buying compost in, it's always important to look for kind of a reputable supplier with a certification such as what it's called PAS 100, PAS 100. So this is a quality standard that stands for Publicly Available Specification for Composted Materials, bit of a mouthful. But if you can see that it's got this PAS 100 on it, it should be a sign that it could be it's from a reputable supplier. And please remember to go peat-free when you're choosing compost if you can. But yes, making sure that your soil or compost is well drained can be important to prevent waterlogging and prevent root rotting. So adding a bit of grit to your soil can help do this, can help improve drainage. And when it comes to watering your trees, we don't want to overwater, as this can both promote shallow rooting, but it can also waterlog soils and make your tree roots more prone from infection from waterborne diseases. Equally, we don't want to underwater or kill our young trees through drought. I mean, in houseplants, we quite often use the finger technique, don't we? We kind of go to a houseplant and we'll stick our finger into the top couple of inches of soil to see if it's dry. This can be applied here for pots, for both pots and in open beds. If your beds are feeling dry in the top few inches, probably need to water them, and the same goes for your pots. Quite often we use a water bath to irrigate young tree whips or trays of seedlings. And if you're going to use a water bath for irrigation, changing the water regularly is quite important, and ideally using fresh rainwater to do that. But as you can see here, you've got water butts set up here, and you can do tests. If you do an annual test each year for some for things like fungus-like microorganisms, things like we call it Phytophthora, which is one of the diseases which can kill off which can be quite nasty for young trees. But you can do a test, and it's very, very similar to a COVID test. You can get one online, and it just works the same way. You put a few drops on, and it'll tell you whether or not you've got any of these nasties in your water. So we're just keeping an eye on whether or not your water sources has anything, as it can help reduce the spread as well. We've talked about the space requirement for trees earlier, and we'll emphasize this point again. Don't overcrowd a space. You want to allow good airflow in and around your seedlings, as you can see here. And when we're thinking about where to grow our trees, growing different species in separate sections of a bed or in pots separated by a gap of a metre or so is important. And also not growing the same species in the same place every single year. It can help reduce the risk of diseases building up in the soil and kind of reinfecting new trees when they get put in. So having a bit of a cycle in where trees will kind of migrate around tree species will migrate around your tree nursery each year, not keeping things in the same spot every time is important. And we can do things that can actually physically deter pests and diseases. So you can see in the middle here, we've got some horticultural netting, and that can be put around growing areas, and this can protect growing trees from some of our abiotic factors, things like frost and sun scorch, but then also protect from biotic things like birds and insects, including butterflies. Caterpillars can quite quickly defoliate young tree leaves, so having some netting that goes around them can deter them. If you've got rabbits or deer or things like that, you might need to fence off your nursery or find a way of getting protection from those animals up. But only do this if it's completely necessary. It's quite an expensive task to go fencing off your nursery. So get to know your site first. Make sure that you do have these pests. If you do have the pests, then think about fencing them. Foot dips are something that we might have used in the past or remember. If anybody remembers foot and mouth disease, or if you've ever gone to a walk-through enclosure at a zoo, you might have seen some foot dips. And using shoe dips and cleaning tools after use with disinfectant can really help the spread of pests and diseases on site in your nursery. And putting little signposts up can help people know and remind them to do that. So weeds will compete with your trees for water and nutrients, and can also leave your trees malnourished and open to infection. So one way to keep on top of them is to use a thick layer of mulch, which is the activity that we're doing on the far right here on this willow bed. But you've got to bear in mind that wood chip can also be a source of infection. If we're getting wood chip from elsewhere, it has a potential to bring infection in with it if the wood chip's been made from infected trees. So using a trusted supplier who can say that yes, the trees that have gone into this haven't come from a clearance job where they've been asked to clear a load of diseased trees, can be good. And if you can ask your supplier for well rotted down wood chip, that's another way of making sure that pests and diseases are limited within that. And if you have the space, you could even grow your own wood chip. So this is a willow bed that's being planted up, and willows are fantastic species to create wood chip from. Its bark has got loads of loads of interesting compounds in. One of them is salicylic acid, and it acts as a kind of quite a really good antimicrobial, has antimicrobial properties, which means that in a wood strip, it can be really good for not just blocking out light and therefore stopping weeds growing, but can also suppress weeds from being slightly antiseptic as well. So if you can create a space where you're going to harvest willow and create wood chip, that's another way of doing it, but that's quite advanced, and you need a bit more space to do that. But we can build into our tree growing practices ways to work to help biosecurity. So labeling is really, really, really important, and we want to try and create a label pathway all the way from when and where a seed was collected in the local area. And that kind of labeling wants to follow that seed to seedling all the way through to when it becomes a tree, which is then lifted, all the way through to where it's going to be planting its final location. So that we have a label traceability all the way from where a tree is planted, what project, all the way through to where the seed was sourced. And then we can help monitor and trace any spread of pests or diseases. There's loads of different ways you can do this, all the way from doing it by hand or using spreadsheets and using apps. And there's a brilliant project that Coventry University are doing called the Growing Connections Project. And they recently did a really good session online, which is recorded all about record keeping and traceability. So there'll be a link dropping into the chat now. So please do go and have a look at that. And some tree nurseries don't just grow trees from seed, but take loads of trees from other reputable suppliers like the Forestry Commission or Woodland Trust. At the end of the season, quite often they have trees which are coming out of the cold storage. We talked about a cold store or cold shed before, and they'll need to empty those cold stores ready for the new trees the following season. So they'll quite often give them to local planting projects or community tree nurseries to grow on, ready for those planting projects. And it's good practice that if you are doing this, you're accepting trees on from somewhere else. If you can, it's good to keep them in a quarantine area for a few months before moving them into the locations where you might want to grow them on in your tree nursery. And you want to keep them in one spot so you can monitor them regularly and check for pests and diseases. So if that's what the model that you're going from, you're accepting donations from other nurseries and having them in, then making sure that you've got an area where you can kind of keep them quarantined for a little bit is important. On this note, having a look at your trees each month and recording any pest or diseases is good practice. So in the Tree Growers Guide, we have a list of pests and diseases that are what we call notifiable. And this just means that if we spot them there, then we should report them to a service which is called Tree Alert, which is an online biosecurity tool, and that's run by Forest Research. But that you shouldn't be off put by the number of pests and diseases out there. There's quite a reduced list of ones that are identifiable. And if you're uncertain about any pest or disease, you should always try and speak to someone who might know what it is, so you can to kind of put you at rest. But putting in writing what you regularly do for biosecurity and putting it on show, like in these posters here, can tell visitors exactly what you're doing, and so that you understand that what you're trying to achieve, and so they can be more aware on site as well. And if you're looking at taking your tree growing to the next level and begin selling your trees or supplying to certain projects and suppliers, you might need to think about signing up to certain biosecurity accreditations. Now, we're not going to spend long on this at all, and we're not going to go into much detail, as it's potentially not relevant to many of the tree growers out there today. If you're just starting out, you might not need to worry about this. But if you're wanting to begin collecting seed and growing big numbers of trees and planting large areas of land to create new woodlands and forests, then you might need to think about registering with the Forestry Commission to market what we call forest reproductive material, which just means anything from any reproductive part of a plant. That could be fruits, it could be seeds, cones, it could be cuttings. And some project funders may have prerequisites for buying trees to ensure that the tree growers are achieving certain biosecurity levels and operating in a certain way. So this includes here we've got the UK and Ireland Grown Assurance Scheme, which is the Woodlands Trust Assurance Scheme, and we've also got Plant Healthy, which is like an industry standard, and some grants, grant funding stipulate that if you want to buy trees using their money, that they want those trees to come from suppliers who can show that they've got one of these assurances. But it gets quite complex, and for more information on all of these, the Community Tree Nursery Collaborative recently did a webinar on this exact topic, so please do watch that, as it's got lots of kind of detail about biosecurity assurance schemes and things like that. And they also have an upcoming open space session on biosecurity on the 28th of April, so please do go to that, and a link will be dropping into the chat for these now. Okay, so I've talked enough now and rambled on, and I hope you found that useful. But now we're going to go to a tree growing project in Shropshire where Janet is helping grow on the next generation of Shropshire's trees. So, hello, Janet. Are you there?
Hello. Yes.
Hi. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi. Thanks for inviting me.
No, thank you for coming along. So yeah, welcome, Janet. I've got these slides here, so I will click and if you're ready to go.
Okay. So my name's Janet. I don't have any background at all in horticulture or tree growing, so I'm a complete amateur to this sort of work. So I was approached to see if by Shropshire Council actually, to see if I would be interested in growing some trees, and I said yes and set off on an adventure. So next slide. Well, yeah. So why? So well, we need more trees. So I've been working with CPRE and their Shropshire Hedgerow Heroes project. And last year we planted so many hedges, we ran out of trees. So I thought it was a good idea to maybe join a small army of people to grow local trees, so we didn't start importing stuff. So we need to plant more trees, and they need to be everywhere. We've lots of ancient oaks in Shropshire, but we've no succession planning, and we've got a big problem with ash dieback. So hundreds of trees being taken down at the moment by the highways department all across Shropshire, and it's depleting our tree stock massively and putting at risk all the things that live on those trees, which we don't want to lose. So, but CPRE in Shropshire have been doing this fantastic project of planting back hedges, and we planted back, well, lots and lots of hedges. And I've also been working with an organisation called Middlemarches Community Land Trust, and through Middlemarches Community Land Trust, we've been talking to town and parish councils, and every town and parish council could start a small community tree nursery. So there are 184 town and parish councils, and if every one of those grew 200 trees, we'd end up with 36,800 potential trees every year. So next slide. So for early support from Shropshire Council via Trees Outside Woodlands initiative, they offered me a small grant, and with that small grant, I bought a polytunnel, some compost, some pots and root trainers, and we prepared this. We've got quite a big garden, and we prepared this bit of land in front of our house for a tree nursery. It didn't take very long to prepare. We just cleared it and set off. We also own 2 acres of small oak woodland, so we agreed to grow 200 oak trees from our own woodland acorns. So we've got the provenance for the trees. So grant funding came through in October 2022, and we caught COVID. So we were delayed we were both quite ill. By the time we recovered, it was too late for acorn collecting. But what we had is lots and lots of little saplings all across our garden. So we dug them up, put them in pots, and they were surprisingly successful. And so far they've survived. So we've got about 30 of those, which set us off on the tree collection. And in 2023, we started to collect acorns, but we collected them off the trees. not from the ground, because what we found was any that we collected from the ground, they were already spoiled by mice and other pests. So we discovered there's a short collection window of about 3 weeks in October. We also discovered that mice are determined and hungry. So we needed to make the acorns that we planted mouse proof. We lost the first batch. We've just planted them in plant pots, put them in our polytunnel. And when I went back a few days later, they'd all been eaten, every one. So we also discovered that not all the acorns we collect will germinate. So it's a bit hit and miss. We collected both sorts of acorns, and those trees are all local to us. And we tried planting other species, predominantly holly and apple trees, just to see what happened. So next one. So we tried several methods. Root trainers were the best by far. They've got a top, the root trainers with a top to them, and they were protected from the mice straight away. And we tried in plant pots, so we planted several acorns in a plant pot, but they weren't easy to protect. So we tried covering them with mesh, covering them with glass, and somehow the mice still got in. So we went back to root trainers. So next slide. So here are the saplings. We dug them up, planted them in pots, and they seem to be good so far. And we also started to plant saplings straight into the ground. And again, they've been good so far. So we've got about 100 of those little saplings in the ground. They're about 6 inches tall now. Next slide. So through distribution, we're going to go through CPRE, Hedgerow Heroes, through the Land Trust, Caring for God's Acres, or planting in churchyards, and through the National Trust of Stepping Stones project, which is a big project here in Shropshire at Carding Mill Valley. And also plan to give them out through local citizens. Through Middlemarches Community Land Trust, we're running all sorts of events, and I plan to give a tree out to anybody who's interested in planting a tree. So that's it from us.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Janet. That's really, really interesting. It's great to see. It's great to see you doing work where it's where you are. Well, Janet, do you want to pop back onto camera and is that all right? Hello. It's great to see that you're doing work which is directly feeding into projects which are kind of helping tree planting in your local area. Obviously, you're very lucky to have a woodland on site which you can kind of source seeds from. But if you were to do it, you didn't have that woodland. How else would you be able to collect seed in your local area?
Yeah, so we decided to plant acorns, or find acorns, from 2 sources. So from our own trees, which are mostly sessile oaks, but also from veteran trees that are scattered all around South Shropshire. So we've got a number of veteran trees which are like within walking distance of our house, and one in particular in Craven Arms, which is a fantastic tree, and I must take a photograph of it when it's in full bloom. And we collected quite a lot of acorns from this tree because I don't think it's going to be there for much longer. It's being damaged and set on fire and all sorts of stuff happening to it, which is a tragedy, but it's an amazing sort of specimen. So we did collect acorns from other trees as well.
Brilliant. And then, do you think it's doable for anyone? Do you think anyone could get involved in doing this kind of thing? And what tips would you give for anyone who's just out there thinking, "Oh, I've not done this before, but I like the sound of it. How can I get involved?"
Well, give it a try.
Yeah.
Which is what we did. I mean, I've got no experience in growing trees, and we planted. Well, the target was 200, and we've gone well over 200 in terms of germinated acorns and saplings that we dug up from other places. I had a friend that helped me as well with saplings. So she'd planted acorns last year in her garden and then dug them up, and we've replanted them here now. And that seems to have worked so far. So we've hit our target, and I'm so thrilled by it now that I'm intending to build more beds, grow more trees, and keep going. And we'll learn as we go along. I've picked up a lot of tips from today's talk already. So,
Oh,
yeah.
brilliant. Perfect. Thanks. Well, thanks so much. What we'll do is that we'll go on to Phil's section now, and then at the end we're going to have a question and answer section. So if there's any questions you want to ask Janet, then we'll do that. But I'm going to reshare my screen, and we are going to go to our very own Phil Powler. So Phil is our head of major tree planting projects, and he's kind of our all-round tree propagation whiz. And he has created for us a couple of videos of jobs that you can be doing at this time of year. This time of year when seeds are germinating, what you can be doing. So I'll share the screen now, and we're going to go over to that. So you can bear with us.
So one of the jobs that you can be thinking about this time of year is actually sowing your seed. So February and March time is a great time of year to be sowing seed. This could be seed that you've collected the previous season, or it might be seed that you collected more than a year ago. So for example, we've got some yew seed here that I'm going to be sowing. So this was collected from a yew tree local to me, and this has been stratifying for a couple of years. So it's been within a sandbox in a cold environment, and that will hopefully assist in breaking its dormancy. So here you can see I've got a little station set up for doing some seed sowing, and we're going to be sowing in a traditional seed tray here, which are again quite good if you've got a reasonable amount of seed. You can use a half tray if you've only got a small amount of seed to sow. It's always really useful to sterilize your seed tray before you sow into it. And again, you can use something like a diluted Milton solution or a weak J's fluid solution to sterilize some of your horticultural equipment. You can buy other kind of branded horticultural sterilizing fluids if you prefer, but Milton does the job just as well. So always useful to give them a good clean following the previous season, just to get rid of the risk of any kind of fungal infections that might be hanging around on some of your plastics. There is a bit of a process with preparing your seed tray. So again, we're going to be using a peat-free compost. So we would recommend trying to use peat-free where possible. And what you're going to do, you're going to be dropping in your compost very loosely into your seed tray. And this compost is already a little bit moist, which is great because we're going to need that moist environment to help the seeds to germinate. So again, you can see I'm not really pushing down the compost as I'm dropping it into the tray. I'm literally just crumbling it in so that it's nice and light, and you can see that I'm filling it to well above the top level of the tray. So when your tray is nicely filled, what you're going to use then, you're going to use what we call a striking off board, and we're just going to move that across the tray and just sweep off that extra layer of compost off the tray. And again, if we've got any little gaps, we're just going to sprinkle a little bit more in to fill any of those gaps that we've got within the tray. Like so, and then I'm just going to strike that off again. Okay, so once we've got our nicely leveled off tray, a really important part of the process is then just to firm your compost down. So we'll then use a piece of wood, and we're literally just going to firm down onto our compost to make a nice firm surface within which the seeds can get some purchase. Okay. So you can see I'm putting nice even pressure just over our seed tray and firming that down like so. Okay, once we're nicely firmed, we're then in a position where we're ready to sow our seed into the tray. So I'm just going to systematically sprinkle in some of our yew seed. I mean, the yew seed's great because it's quite large, so it's very easy to see how you're distributing it over the surface there. Again, we don't want to have it too thickly distributed. If the seedlings are too close together, that can lead to a bit of an issue with lack of air circulation, and damping off can occur. So we're going to put a reasonable number of seeds, but we're going to leave a little bit of space between our seedlings, just to give them room to spread out as they germinate and grow. And again, there's nothing to stop me sowing a number of seed trays, again with the U seed here. Okay, so once we've sown our seed there, I'm then going to just sprinkle on a little bit more compost over the top, just to cover those seeds. So nice light covering. Like so. So all of our seeds are now covered. And then very important, it's always important so you remember what seed you've got where, is to pop in a seed label, and within that you can indicate the species of tree that you've sown, along with details of when you've sown the seed, and also information about where that seed was collected, so the origin of the tree. So this was from a local ewe that's 5 minutes around the corner from me, so I would log that so I have the origins of the seed as well. So once we finish covering our seeds and we've labelled our seed tray, we're going to want to make sure that our seed tray is well irrigated, and there are a couple of options from that. So you can actually take your tray and pop it into a shallow water bath, and water it from the bottom. In that way the water will filter up from the base of the tray through the perforation holes that you've got in the bottom. Or another alternative is that you can use a fine mister, such as the one we've got here, and again just very gently irrigate the surface of the compost. You can see I'm using a very fine mist here, which is ideal because we don't want to be creating so much water that we're going to be moving around the seeds and kind of affecting the distribution. So a watering can isn't really appropriate for this type of seed sowing, and it's really good to have a fine mister like we've got here. Okay, we just want to make sure that that's nicely irrigated. And then one of the key things to successful germination is we need to make sure that this seed tray stays moist, and we want to prevent the water from leaving and from drying out through evaporation. So it's really useful if you can use some form of cover. So here we've got a cheap plastic seed tray cover. That's going to keep the humidity within the tray and prevent it from drying out and keep the moisture in. And it's great that we've got a little bit of height within this lid, so it allows room for our germinating seedlings. Whereas if you were going to maybe lay on a piece of perspex or a piece of glass or cling film over the surface, that doesn't really leave much room for the germinating seedlings. So this is ideal that we've got plenty of space there for our seedlings to grow into. Once we've finished here, again, you want to be moving your tray to a nice warm and light environment. If you're doing this on a commercial basis, maybe larger scale, you might have access to a larger propagator that could have some bottom heat. So you could put multiple trays into that propagator where they'll be kept warm and again in a nice humid atmosphere. You may want to put them into a greenhouse, or you may possibly have access to a polytunnel that you could use. So once your seedlings have germinated, you're going to want to think about pricking them out and putting them into some different containers that will allow them to grow on into bigger seedlings and saplings. I've got an example of some germinated seedlings here that I just wanted to show you. And it's always quite useful when you're handling seedlings if you can maybe use kind of like a small stick, kind of a bit like a cocktail stick, for example. This is really useful because you need to be very, very delicate to make sure that you don't damage the stem of the seedlings. I always suggest maybe using a stick like this rather than a pair of tweezers, because again, it's quite easy with tweezers that you can damage the fragile stem of the seedlings. So in this pot here, I've just got some seedlings that I just wanted to show you. So if we have a look here, a little bit fiddly. You'll see this is actually the seedling of a silver birch tree. So this is some seed that germinated quite by accident. It was just some seed I collected in a bucket, and it just naturally germinated. And you can see the root and then the seed leaves. And I just wanted to tell you that this seedling, this is actually a little bit too early to transplant. So if you have a look at the seedling here, you can see all that it's got is these this set of seed leaves. And really we need to wait until the seedling has a set of what we call true leaves, which will be its next set of leaves, its birch leaves, rather than just the seed leaves. So I've kind of just brought these out to show you an example of a germinated seedling, but again to explain that you really need to wait until you have that second set of leaves before the seedling is ready to prick out. Now, when we start to think about potting on and growing on our tree seedlings, we've got a couple of different options available to us. So again, it might be that you want to use one of these modular trays as your initial phase. And again, you would fill these trays in a very similar way that you would your seed tray. Always important to try and make sure that these are sterilized as well before use. And then you can literally dib a hole into each of the cells, and you can put one of your germinated seedlings from your seed tray into each of these modular cells. Another option is actually when you are using larger seeds, for example the yew that we were sowing earlier, or potentially something such as oak where you've got a very large seed, or maybe hornbeam, for example, you may well want to sow a seed directly into your modules. So you can direct sow into these modules. One of the advantages of sowing into a seed tray is that takes account of any failures. So again, if you do get any failures, you're only pricking out the viable seeds. Whereas if you're sowing into these seed modules, it might be that some of your seeds aren't viable, so you then have to re-sow or put another seedling at another date. A technique that you can use is that if you actually put 2 seeds into each station, you kind of cover your losses a little bit, and then you can always pinch out the weaker of the 2 seedlings if both of them germinate, whereas if one of them fails, at least you've got one there to take over. So that's an option that you can pop 2 in. So again, you can grow your seedlings on in these modules. These modules are quite shallow, so these are really intended kind of for smaller plug plants, but it's a nice way that you can get your seedlings started in phase 1. And then you always have the option that you can put them into a slightly deeper tray, or potentially something like a root trainer later on. And you can see here we've got a really nice example of, these are some oaks that were grown in planted up into a root trainer last season. And you can see these are great for establishing a really nice healthy root system ready to go. So these you could well just kind of plant out as cell-grown trees, or you have the option that these could then be planted out into a bed and grown on to become bare root, but obviously very nice as a small cell-grown tree. You can see a nice example here of where we've got the 2 seedlings that have grown in one module. So that's the example where you've got 2 together, and you can potentially pinch out the weaker of the 2 and allow the stronger one to grow on. If you've got access to a polytunnel, it can be really useful for extending your growing season and help you to start your tree seedlings earlier. So the great things about polytunnels is that they warm up a bit earlier in the season, so while it's still cold outside, you can actually do your seed sowing inside and get your seedlings growing within the tunnel. And it will also extend your growing season, so the polytunnel remains a little bit warmer as the temperature starts cooling outside as we move towards autumn and winter. You may not have your own polytunnel, but you might find that there's a tunnel that's underused in the local area. So a good example is this tunnel's within a local secondary school. And again, it's available during the evenings and the weekends. So schools are often very keen to have some additional support from other local groups who might help them to keep their tunnel irrigated outside of the core school hours. So one of the benefits of polytunnels is obviously that they warm up a little bit quicker, and they can provide you with a nice warm environment. They can also provide you with a bit of rain shelter. So again, a polytunnel is a great facility if you haven't got any other cover on your site, that you can actually come inside and do some work in the dry if the weather's bad. Although they warm up quicker and hold the heat, that can be a disadvantage as well. So during the summer, you can actually find that polytunnels can get very hot, and you will need to think about actually irrigating that tunnel to make sure that your plants inside stay well watered and hydrated. So some tunnels have venting on the sides, and you can actually roll up the side of the tunnel to allow air movement within the tunnel. Or if you're actually thinking about constructing or purchasing a tunnel, you might want to think about one that's got doors either end, so that you can allow for some air movement through the tunnel to keep it a little bit cooler. Some people will put a large water butt or water barrel within their polytunnel. Having that standing water, actually when it heats up, it allows for some evaporation to actually keep the humidity levels within the tunnel quite high. And another technique is called damping down, that's often used within greenhouses and polytunnels, where you can put water down on the floor, so before you leave the tunnel, and again that helps to make quite a nice humid atmosphere and stops your plants from drying out as quickly.
Okay, thank you so much, Phil. That was they were brilliant, those videos. Are you there, Phil? You pop your camera in and microphone on. Hello.
Hello, Will.
Thank you so much for those. They're really good.
Very welcome.
Yeah, so I've got, before we go to the question and answer at the end, I've got a couple of questions myself. So you've obviously sown your seeds into a seed tray, and then you're going to prick those out and put them into either pots or root trainers, things like that. How long would it take? Obviously, you said you're going to wait for your seedlings to germinate and create that second leaf before your proper tree leaves before germinating. How long would that take, and at what size would you think about taking them out of, say, the seed tray, putting them into your root trainers, or even into the ground?
Well, I mean, as I said, ideally, when you've got that the second set of what we call the true tree seeds, not the seed leaves, that second set of leaves, they are pretty much ready to prick out when you can see those true leaves. And when you're handling them, it's always really useful if you can handle them by the leaf. And as I said, try and avoid touching the stem if you can, or just use your stick to kind of just gently move the stem. You're going to prevent any further damage. It's much better if you can get them out of the tray reasonably quickly once you've got those second leaves, because you're going to give them a bit more space to grow out in as well. One of the things that if you're using a kind of specialist seed composts, obviously the compost that I used there was a general purpose peat free. That has got some nutrients in it, but a lot of these seed composts, they are very nutrient poor, because they're really looking to attract the seed to germinate rather than to grow. So actually, by transplanting it out of that seed tray into a better compost and starting to feed it, you're going to accelerate the growth of that seedling. So generally, the rule is, yeah, once they've got their second set of leaves, good time to transplant them.
Good time.
You do have to be quite careful with light levels as well. So I made the recommendation around maybe popping them in a polytunnel or a greenhouse, so that you've got good levels of light and even light, because what you will find is seedlings can get quite leggy if they have maybe got one-sided or not even light as they develop.
Brilliant, thank you. And the species-wise, obviously, I think you were growing yew there, which takes a good couple of years to stratify. What other kind of species would take 2 years? Because I think some people might collect some seed and stratify it, expecting it to grow in one season, and they could be a little bit disappointed when all of us they're like, where are my trees? They're not germinating. And it could just be a species that it needs a couple of years. So have you got any tips on what species might take a couple of years and what species might just be good to go ready in one season?
Yeah, well, I'd obviously recommend the wonderful publication, which is the Tree Growth Guys, which has got lots of details around kind of some of the species that take slightly longer or might need slightly different preparation techniques. So we obviously talked a little bit about stratification there, but you've also got the option that you might want to be scarifying seeds, so seeds that have got a harder casing. It can be quite useful to scarify them with a rough surface to nick that casing and allow water to enter to help them to germinate. So there's a vast amount of information there, but again, different tree seeds will germinate at different rates. For example, we had a good example. I showed the birch seed there, which funnily, I mean, that's some birch that I literally just collected and chucked in a bucket, didn't do anything else to it, and it germinated very, very easily without any special treatment. So that germinated the following season. And again, you'll often find trees like oak will germinate very, very easily. And as long as that shell casing gets broken, they will, they'll put down some root and get away. But the key thing is it's around the preparations. Obviously, I spoke about stratifying the yew for a couple of years, so that's been actually kept in cold environment to help break its dormancy. So different seeds will need those different treatments. Obviously, there's a lot to look at. So I would recommend having a read through our Tree Growers Guide to give you a bit more detailed information on each species.
Brilliant, thank you. All right, we'll answer some questions from the question and answer box. So thank you so much for putting everything in there. Janet, as well, if you're around, and you might be able to answer some questions as well, that'll be great. But we'll kickstart from off with a question from Wendy, who asks, what proportion of grit might you use or recommend if you're filling raised beds all from scratch? How much grit might you put in there? That might be one for you, Phil.
I mean, something I'd say about raised beds is it's quite common that you get the mistake that people make them way too deep. So what happens if you make a really, really deep raised bed, unless you're maybe working with people that might benefit through kind of accessibility needs of having a deep bed that they can sit on the edge, is that you're creating lots of backfill, the requirement of lots of backfill. So generally, you need to think about the time that your trees are going to be within that bed, and generally for a community tree nursery, it's quite a short period that you're looking at probably a couple of years max, and actually the depth of root system that they're going to be developing. And ideally, we want them to be developing a nice fibrous root system rather than a great big deep tap root. So you've got the benefits of kind of lifting and replanting to create that fibrous root system. So my advice is don't go too deep with your beds, and obviously it's great to have a little bit of gravel in the bottom there, as your drainage. So I'd probably say if you're looking at a bed that's round about a foot in depth, that would be ideal. You wouldn't really want more than inch and a half of gravel in the bottom there, just for your extra bit of drainage. But key thing is don't make your beds too deep, because again, it's going to be a waste of labor and a waste of money potentially going too deep.
Brilliant, thank you. And a question from Richard, it's kind of on the similar subject, which was, how do I check if my compost is clear of harmful biotics? So we mentioned briefly in the talk that you can, if you're buying composting, you can check that it's got one of these accreditations like PAS 100, or you can use a hot composting method, or making sure that it's been composted for a longer period of time. But has anybody got any tips for making sure that compost is kind of fairly pest free?
I mean, your suggestion around hot composting there, Will, is obviously really good. So the hotter that you can get your compost, the more likely it is to break down some of those those harmful elements within it. I mean, it is recommended. There are actually a lot of benefits of using kind of your own made garden compost, something that you've been making on your own site, because again, it's going to have a lot more of those the mycorrhiza and the natural bacteria that you're going to want within the compost, rather than maybe buying in something that has been very heavily sterilized. So it might be that if you're buying any commercial compost, it has been sterilized, but you'll be missing some of that beneficial mycorrhiza. But you might have the option that you could always mix that in. So you could well mix that in through adding a little bit of leaf mulch or something similar that you've actually produced on your own site to build in that mycorrhiza.
Brilliant. Okay. I've got a question from Alison, who says she's often given ash saplings which have germinated in local gardens. Should I grow these on and include them in our planting schemes when I'm planting in the parish? I'm concerned because of ash dieback. Is there any advice we can give around the issues of ash? Obviously, there is nationally, we're not necessarily in woodland creation schemes, we're not planting ash at the moment, just because of the problems. But there are schemes in place at the moment where people are trying to grow on disease-resistant varieties of finding ash trees which seem to be resistant and not don't seem to be suffering from it and propagating from those. Have you got any tips for that, Phil?
Well, I'd say, some of the guidance is that where you've got the opportunity that you can leave ash within the environment, we try and encourage that if it's safe to do so. So obviously, everyone's aware a lot of local authorities and landowners are removing ash where it's dangerous, roads, public right of ways. But if you've got some ash trees that actually are still surviving, as you said, well, it's quite good if we can encourage them to seed, around themselves. There's the potential that we can get some natural resistance to ash dieback. So again, it's that thing of maybe allowing ash that's self-generating to grow in place, and we can hopefully identify there is some resistance. But maybe, as you said, it's not ideal to be growing on ash from seed to be used within other projects. But if we can allow that natural growth, that would be more ideal.
Great, thank you. And for yourself, Janet, I've got a question about obviously you've connected with local planting projects. What advice would you give for people who would like to try and grow some trees, but would like to try and grow some trees for a purpose, as in your case, you've been able to give them to a project which has kind of a real impact in your local area? Kind of how would you go about connecting to local projects?
Well, I suppose I'm in a lucky position because I'm already working with other organisations like Middlemarches Community Land Trust. So I'm already connected to other organisations. But I think going through the town and parish council route is a good route. So you only need to find one or two people in any town and parish council. And again, straight away, you've got a good start in terms of making community connections. And often, people are just interested in growing one oak tree, for example. Well, one oak tree is better than no oak trees, isn't it? And I would say try and connect with it. Try and find all the nature groups that are in your area and just start a conversation. And you never know where those conversations are going to lead. So CPRE are a good organisation to connect with, because I think they've been doing hedgerow projects all over the country. Great. We need to plant back those standard trees that we're in danger of losing because they're so old.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Janet. Got another question here from Richard. So should saplings about 1 meter high be lightly pruned to encourage growth? One for you, that Phil, I think. Should saplings be 1 meter high? Should be lightly pruned to encourage growth? Now, I assume there's two types of pruning here that I could be talking about, Richard, which is root pruning or formative pruning. I don't know if you could touch on those two, Phil.
I can touch on both. So formative pruning, obviously, if you take the top out of your tree, you're going to be encouraging bushier growth. So generally, all trees, they have what's called apical dominance, where the lead bud on the leader, it kind of controls the growth of buds lower down through hormones. By nipping out the tip, you're going to be encouraging much more bushy growth, and it's going to encourage that plant to bush out. So my general advice would be not to take the tips out of your plants, because again, you don't necessarily want to be shipping these really bushy plants like that with growth, because it's going to depend on how the final user wants those trees to grow. So it'd be much better about when the trees are actually planted in situ, their final planting location, depending on how the people planting them intend them to grow, whether they're going to maybe be growing them as a hedgerow, or if they want to grow them into standards. The pruning would then follow, depending on the final form that you want for those trees. So I would generally suggest do not nip out the tips when you're in the kind of the tree nursery stage, unless you're going to be growing it into a bigger tree, unless you have plans to actually grow it into a much bigger shaped tree. Quickly on root pruning, obviously root pruning can be quite useful to encourage really nice fibrous rooting. So maybe thinking about having that option, and maybe thinking quite carefully about the medium that you're growing trees in to try and encourage a really, really healthy fibrous root system is going to be ideal. So maybe something a little bit more open in structure.
Thanks so much for that, Phil. Should also say as well, we will talk about root pruning and things like that in a little bit more detail in our autumn and winter webinars, where we'll be thinking about what we need to do to lift trees and what we need to do to be lifting trees and doing a bit of root pruning and planting trees on for a second season, that kind of thing. So we'll cover those kind of things in a future webinar. I've got another. Jeremy and Robert have both sent similar question. So what's a good soil mix to plant out saplings in pots in? And also Robert's asked, do you use gravel for sowing and potting on? A friend tried raising trees from seed in a polytunnel and lost many seedlings due to mildew. How could we avoid this? So how could we avoid things like mildew and things like that?
So on the mildew, I think something I mentioned kind of when we were talking about the polytunnel in the polytunnel video was just around kind of air movement and air ventilation. So, I mean, mildew is often quite common where you don't have a lot of movement around your plants, or you may well have them too dense. So thinking about ventilation of a polytunnel, obviously I spoke about maybe having a polytunnel that's got doors either end, that you can open them. When you've got the bigger commercial tunnels, they'll often have fans that will draw the air through. So always really good to try and encourage lots of air movement. And again, it's going to keep the temperatures down within the tunnel as well. If temperatures are getting too high and you haven't got any venting and you're not damping down, you've got that higher risk as well of problems like mildew that are going to impact on your plants.
Brilliant, thank you. And we've got one more question before we'll have to finish. But it's a very good question. It's how do you check whether your stratified seeds are germinating without damaging the plants at such an early stage when they're really quite delicate?
How do you track that they're germinating?
Yeah, so how do we check that they're germinating? If you say you've got it in a stratification mix, and we want to check that they're germinating and they're all through your stratification mix, how do we make sure that they're germinating without without damaging them?
I mean, what you can do, so for example, with the yew seeds that we had there, they were bagged separately within a mix, and then they were placed within a sand bed. So they're quite easy to extract, and you can obviously have a look inside each of the individual bags where your seed are to check the condition of the seed before you move forward. So rather than kind of having them in quite a large area dispersed, if you bag them individually when you're stratifying them, that can be a lot more useful. And again, I think a lot of people that would maybe use a refrigeration technique, they'd be bagging the seed, and it'd be a lot more obvious if you're going to be doing it within a fridge rather than a sandbox to do your stratification.
And what kind of bag would you use?
Again, something that can be allowed, it can be moist, so something that allow the seeds to stay reasonably moist. So a Hessian bag or something similar to that can be quite useful if you're stratifying in a sandbox.
Right, okay, thank you so much. Janet, Phil, thank you so much for all your help today. It's been really interesting. We're going to have to finish there because we are up to time. But yes, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been great, and it would be really useful if you could help us feedback how today's gone. So the link is it should be going into the chat now. And this is a feedback form from one of our partner organisations who are carrying out research into how people can be better supported to grow trees from seeds. It's part of the Shared Outcomes Trees Outside Woodlands project, and kind of information about their data usage is within the feedback form. But if you could fill that in, it would be really useful, so we can carry on producing sessions which can help people learn all about growing trees from seed, and hopefully increase the number of trees that we manage to plant out. But thank you so much, everyone. It's been a pleasure, and we'll see you all next time. So if you can have a look at our upcoming webinars, and we will send the link around with the recording of today's session, as well as a link to everything that we've linked today, and also a link to our upcoming session. So thanks so much, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Bye.